Hello, and welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory, a podcast where cinema meets society, I suppose you might say. Although sometimes I don't do movie reviews, I occasionally talk about music, sometimes I just talk about society itself, political issues, social topics, and occasionally I do some silly stuff that really has nothing to do with anything. But today we're talking about a film that didn't just push buttons, it pushed the conversation forward. OMG 2, or you might call it Oh My God 2. Now, if you remember OMG, Oh My God, from 2012, that film took a swing at blind faith and religious dogma. And I did a review of that movie on this very same podcast, which you can look up. It might even show up automatically in an algorithm if you're listening to this episode. So I liked that movie, and I'm relatively new to Bollywood movies, as they're called. So it was a nice touch that I watched a movie that was actually, pretty good, that I liked. And this movie, I did promise I would review it, and here I am. I don't always lie. Sometimes I follow through on my promises. So this time around, the sequel isn't just spiritual, it's strategic in a way. OMG 2 shifts the lens to something more taboo in India, sex education. So let's look at how they examine that topic. But first, the movie was released in 2023, and OMG2 is a Hindi language satirical drama, and it's available on Netflix. That's where I watched it. So if you are an American and you have a Netflix account, you can pretty easily watch this one. And if you don't want to listen to the original language, they probably have the audio in English, but beware, the dubbed version of a movie is usually different, both in the words being spoken and also the tone. It's usually different from the original, so be aware of that. It's the same thing if you watch Godzilla movie in the dubbed version versus the original Japanese version. The same thing applies here. If you want a movie that's probably going to sound a little bit goofier because it's not in the original language, you can go with the dubbed version, I suppose. But I've said enough about that. This one was directed by award-winning filmmaker Amit Rai. The film stars Akshay Kumar, who was in the original one. It also has Pankaj Tripathi and Yami Gautam. So I apologize if I didn't pronounce the names correctly. That's a different language from what I normally speak. Although oddly enough, what I learned from living with some Indian students for about 2 months some years ago is that the the language is actually surprisingly easy to um, not necessarily pick up on, but to speak, like to pronounce the words as they're written down, because it's a weird little dynamic, because they often sound the way they look when you write them down in the English form, with the English letters. But anyway, it's a bold move in a space where most mainstream Indian films are still playing it safe. This movie is addressing a topic considered controversial, and the plot centers on Kanti Sharam Mudgal. He's played by Tripathi. He's a devout character. He's a father, but totally clueless when his son is expelled after a sexually explicit incident at school. At least at first, he's totally clueless, but he gets some sensible advice from a surprise source. At first, he's shocked and confused about what's happening to his son. He's critical of his son, but he ends up embarking on a journey that takes him from the temple steps to the courtroom benches, fighting not just for his son, but for the right to educate. So embarrassing situations involving sexuality are easier to avoid. That's the interesting premise here. It's also interesting that the storyline involves a sort of divine disruption. Akshay Kumar, he's not really reprising the role from the first film. This time he's playing a divine messenger, a modern day Nandi to Lord Shiva. He isn't God, but he's definitely channeling something holy, and he's not there to preach, but to guide. So my understanding is that the character was changed from being the Lord Shiva into being a sort of devoted follower, and that was to avoid possible outrage, I guess. And so I just made a reference there. What is Nandi, you might ask, if you're not familiar with the religion? Well, Nandi is a sacred bull. It's Lord Shiva's most devoted follower and his vahana, or vehicle. He's also a gatekeeper to Shiva's abode and a symbol of unwavering devotion, strength, and righteousness. So, worshippers actually will often seek Nandi's blessings before entering Shiva temples, believing he conveys their prayers to Shiva. So, that might have been a little bit of a lesson for you. I just learned about that myself. Um, I'm more familiar with, uh, you know, religions like Christianity than I am with this religion. So, what makes this movie work is how the film walks the tightrope between reverence and rebellion. There's some religious symbolism, but it's not dogmatic, at least not really. It's more about challenging or questioning narratives about society and its unwillingness to accept certain topics. OMG doesn't exactly attack religion, but it uses it as a mirror to expose hypocrisy, sort of like the first movie. You have plenty of discussion of sex, school, and stigma. That's a major uh, theme in this movie. So, at its core, OMG 2 is about the dangerous silence around sex education in India. And let's be clear, sexual health isn't just about biology. It's according to global health standards, it's a state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well being in relation to sexuality. But in India, the moment sex is mentioned in a classroom, it's apparently scandalous, and they don't really care about the science of it. And this movie is trying to change that. So conservative communities often treat knowledge as corruption, but ignorance that's never innocent. This film makes it clear that education is not an indulgence; it should be considered a right, and that makes this movie a little bit bold. And there was both a positive reception to this movie and some resistance. The film stirred some things up. OMG 2 was scrutinized by India's Central Board of Film Certification. There were over 25 cuts, an adults only rating, and religious references were trimmed like hedges. But that didn't stop the conversation, and the movie is reasonably popular. It's it's possible that the attempts to censor it actually fueled its popularity. That is sometimes how things go. It's like when you slap a parental advisory sticker on an album. Sure, sometimes it might hurt sales because it doesn't appear in all of the normal store, or at least it didn't appear in all of the normal stores back when people were buying CDs and tapes and things. But it also did create an interest in the album that can happen when things are being censored. And that might have happened with this movie. Like I said, it's on Netflix now, so if you do want to watch it, I do have a little bit of a warning. It is a bit of a longer movie. It's actually 2.5 hours long, but that seems to be a pretty regular thing these days for movies to be over 2 hours. So I guess that just makes it sort of a normal movie. And the critics had mixed opinions on this, but no one denied the boldness of the script. And nearly everyone agreed that Tripathi's performance was a solid part of the story. Some people, I'm sure, would consider it to be sort of a master class. He definitely commanded attention during most of his scenes, so I have no problem with the acting in this movie. I would say it is a little bit longer than it needed to be. If I was going to have a main critique, that would probably be it. Even though when you say something like that, it makes it sound like you have a short attention span or something. But that's not necessarily true because the movie Casino is at least 3 hours long, and you know what? That movie kind of breezes by. That's a movie that proves that you can have a movie that is 3 hours long and still have it be not such a, I guess, a, not have it feel like a time consumer. I guess I'll put it like that. So this movie, I think it probably could have been like 2 hours long and it would have been fine. So I'm sure some people would disagree on that, but I think they could have trimmed some parts of it out, perhaps. What makes OMG stand out isn't just what it says, it's what it dares to say in a country where silence is often safer. In a media landscape dominated by formula, you have heroes, dance numbers, villains, and sometimes it can be considered rinse and repeat. I think this movie is probably different. I think it asked questions and hard questions that not a lot of other movies are asking, at least in the country of India. And I suppose, I don't know enough about Bollywood movies. I'm sure there are other movies that similarly have been bold in the past. There usually are. It's rare that there's just one movie that is sort of breaking the mold. Usually there's a sort of compendium of them. Is that the right word? I don't even know. But anyway, usually there's a confluence of factors culturally that are part of the zeitgeist that will inevitably, hopefully, change society for the better and make things a little bit more progressive, I guess you might say. So, how do we protect kids without educating them? Why is sex still a dirty word when it's part of every human life? And why do we expect kids to know better when we don't teach them better? Those are some of the simple questions that this movie, I think, puts forward. So OMG 2 isn't perfect, but in a way it's important. It puts the spotlight on a broken system and hands the mic to those who are too often ignored. It challenges a society to choose between shame and science. And maybe, just maybe, it reminds people that the road not taken, the uncomfortable, complicated, honest road, is the one worth taking. And for whatever flaws this movie may have, I think that really kind of makes up for those. So I think I've said enough. I've been kind of clunky in this review, but uh, it was still an interesting one. I'm still getting used to the Bollywood movie experience. I think I picked an interesting one with this one, and of course the original OMG movie. So it was a pretty solid introduction to Bollywood. The only other experience that I really have with Bollywood, or whatever you want to call it, is the Netflix show called Sacred Games. and that's a solid show. I did recaps of that back in the day, so I'm still pretty new to this, so it's a learning process. So anyway, I've said enough. Until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep watching.